The last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged rim of the canyon, painting the exposed rock in hues of burnt orange and deep violet. I watched it from my window, a familiar ritual, before turning back to the glowing array of screens that dominated my life. The desert canyon at twilight was a spectacular view, one I'd chosen precisely for its isolation. No light pollution, no stray radio signals, just me and the universe, a silent conversation only I was privileged to overhear. My home, if I could call it that, was a haphazard collection of salvaged electronics, tangled wires, and stacks of research papers that threatened to topple with the slightest tremor. Dust motes danced in the projector beams slicing across the room, illuminating decades of obsession. An ancient oscillating fan whirred in the corner, doing little against the lingering heat, but its rhythmic drone was a comforting constant. I ran a hand through my already disheveled hair, the scent of stale coffee and ozone clinging to my fingertips. Another night, another delve into the unfathomable. For years, I'd been hunting for an echo, a whisper from the cosmic background noise that didn't quite fit. My colleagues, back when I still had any, called it a fool's errand. They chased supernova and exoplanets, tangible things. I sought the gaps, the silences that hummed with a different kind of truth. My current pet project involved sifting through terabytes of archived radio astronomy data, filtering out the known, the expected, the mundane. It was like searching for a specific grain of sand on every beach in the world, only I was convinced that particular grain held the key to an entirely new kind of beach. Tonight, the usual static hummed, a familiar lullaby. My custom algorithms chewed through the data streams, looking for deviations, for patterns that didn't resolve into natural phenomena. It was tedious, mind-numbing work for anyone else, but for me, it was a meditation, a communion. I leaned forward, my face inches from the main monitor, tracing lines of spectroscopic data with a finger that felt more like a divining rod. Then, a flicker. My heart gave a jolt, not a dramatic thud, but a quiet, internal lurch. I paused the stream, my breath catching in my throat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, buried deep beneath layers of cosmic microwave background radiation and instrumental noise. I isolated the frequency band, running it through a series of increasingly aggressive filters. The initial excitement was purely scientific, the thrill of discovery, the adrenaline surge of proving a long-held hypothesis. This was what I lived for. On the screen, a pattern began to emerge. A series of pulses, impossibly regular, impossibly complex. It wasn't random, not even pseudo-random. It defied the known physics of astrophysical emissions. No pulsar, no quasar, no known stellar event could generate this signature. It was too clean, too precise, too ordered. I spent the next hour rerunning the data, checking my calibrations, cross-referencing with older archives. Every check came back clean. The signal was real, embedded within the raw data from one of my most sensitive arrays, collected nearly 3 years ago, then overlooked. It had been there, waiting. My initial hypothesis had been that if there was something truly ancient, truly fundamental, lurking in the universe, it wouldn't speak in the language of stars or gas clouds. It would speak in mathematics, in pure information, encoded with a complexity that would bypass our current understanding, only revealing itself to someone looking for the impossible. And here it was. I pulled up the spectrogram, staring at the intricate peaks and troughs. The pattern repeated, not in a simple loop, but evolving, each iteration adding a layer of depth, a new harmonic that seemed to build upon the last. It was like listening to a symphony composed by a consciousness that understood the universe in a way I could only dream of. A dry laugh escaped my lips, sounding alien in the quiet room. "You magnificent bastard," I whispered to the empty air, the desert outside a silent witness. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a revelation. This was bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my notebook, already scribbling furiously, calculations spilling onto the page, diagrams taking shape. The scientific excitement, however, was quickly morphing into something else, a gnawing hunger, a singular focus. I forgot about the pre-prepared meal cooling on the makeshift table beside my console. I ignored the ache in my shoulders, the dryness in my eyes. The outside world, the desert canyon at twilight, even the memory of the sunset, receded into irrelevance. There was only the signal and my quest to understand it. I needed to decode it. Every fiber of my being screamed for it. This wasn't just data. It felt like a message, deliberately hidden, waiting for a mind capable of unearthing it. The patterns weren't just mathematical. They seemed to carry an inherent logic, a narrative, and I was the only one who could hear it. As the hours bled into one another, the faint, repeating pulses on my screen began to feel less like abstract data and more like a presence. A steady, insistent thrum that resonated not just through the circuits of my equipment, but within the very bones of my skull. It felt like a key turning, unlocking something deep within me, or perhaps unlocking me from something. I didn't know which, but the question was already starting to consume me, eclipsing everything else. My obsession had found its anchor, and it was pulling me into depths unknown. The last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged rim of the desert canyon at twilight, painting the exposed rock in hues of burnt orange and deep violet. The desert canyon at twilight was a spectacle, but the real show, the one that truly held me captive, pulsed in the data streams before me. Sleep became a concept I dimly recalled from a distant past. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside my fortified windows and the growing stack of empty coffee mugs. My beard, once meticulously trimmed, now scraggled, an itchy testament to my singular focus. Meals were an afterthought, often forgotten entirely or replaced by nutrient paste squeezed directly from a tube. I knew I was neglecting myself, but the signal demanded everything. It was a siren song, a cosmic puzzle box that had swallowed my attention whole. My phone, a relic of a life I barely remembered, sat silent on a corner of the desk, its screen dark. A couple of missed calls from a colleague I vaguely recalled. A text from a family member, probably asking if I was still alive. I couldn't bring myself to care. Their concerns felt trivial, distant, like echoes from another dimension when compared to the vast, silent conversation I was attempting to join. Hours, then days, then weeks melted away in a haze of caffeine and concentrated effort. My fingers flew across the holographic keyboards, adjusting algorithms, refining filters, pushing the processing power of my custom-built systems to their absolute limits. The raw data, initially a chaotic blizzard of static, began to yield. It wasn't just noise, not merely the random hiss of the universe's breath. There was structure, intricate, interwoven sequences emerged from the digital cacophony, patterns that defied any known natural phenomenon. These weren't simple repeating pulses or mathematical progressions. They were fractal, self-referential, like a language designed by something that understood dimensions I could only theorize about. My breath hitched the first time I saw it clearly. A series of nested waveforms, each one containing a subtly altered version of the last, spiraling inward, infinitely complex yet perfectly ordered. It was information, undeniably. Not a message in any human sense, but a signature, a proof of intelligence so profound it made my own intellect feel like a child's crayon drawing. This wasn't a random cosmic anomaly. This was deliberate and ancient. My mind reeled with the implications, a thrilling terror blossoming in my chest. Then the dreams started. Not the usual jumbled nonsense of an exhausted mind, but vivid, almost hyperreal scenarios. I'd find myself in vast, echoing spaces, not quite empty, but filled with an unseen presence. Other times, I was in my own lab, but the screens would display not data, but my own reflection, distorted, eyes wide with a fear I couldn't articulate even in the dream state. At first, I dismissed them as auditory fatigue, the brain playing tricks after countless hours spent analyzing faint signals. A low hum, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant, off-key chord. Then, sometimes, a faint murmur, like voices speaking just outside my range of comprehension, a soft, sibilant rustling of sounds that held no discernible words. I'd spin my chair around, convinced a loose wire was buzzing, or the desert wind was whistling through a poorly sealed vent. But there was never anything. The feeling of being watched intensified. It started as a prickle on the back of my neck when I was engrossed in a particularly dense data stream. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt porous, its walls no longer offering the absolute security I had always taken for granted. I checked the locks, the security cameras, the perimeter sensors. Everything was secure. Yet, the feeling persisted, a silent, unseen observer breathing down my neck. I knew it was irrational. My isolation, my lack of sleep, the sheer mental strain of decoding something so utterly alien, it was all taking its toll. My mind, I reasoned, was simply starting to fray at the edges. Perhaps it was something more. Something that had found a way to reach beyond the stars, not just into my systems, but into the very fabric of my perception, unraveling it thread by meticulous thread. The patterns on my screens grew ever more intricate, ever more compelling, pulling me deeper into their labyrinthine embrace, while the world outside my lab and the sanity within my own head slowly began to slip away. The desert canyon at twilight was a beautiful, isolating backdrop, perfect for what I did or what I was trying to do. Tonight, though, the familiar comfort of its vast silence felt different, heavier. My eyes, gritty from hours of staring, scanned the data stream. Thousands of lines of gibberish, mathematical noise, yet beneath it, a rhythmic pulse. I'd been chasing that pulse for weeks, trying to separate the wheat from the cosmic chaff. It wasn't just a pattern. It was an intricate, layered structure, like an impossible fractal, designed by a mind far beyond anything I could fathom. My fingers flew across the keyboard, commands flashing, algorithms churning. I was running a new iteration of the parsing engine, one I'd painstakingly built from scratch, designed to identify semantic commonalities across disparate frequency bands. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate gamble born of sleep deprivation and a stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Then a flicker. A sequence of symbols resolved itself on the main display, not as a mathematical constant or a physical law, but as a unit. A word, perhaps. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass. It wasn't English, or any known human language, but the parser had flagged it as a recurring element, a key. I isolated it, fed it back into the engine, and watched as the cascading lines of data began to reconfigure. It wasn't a sudden, blinding revelation. It was a slow, creeping horror, like watching a perfectly formed ice sculpture melt to reveal something squirming beneath. The signal wasn't just information. It was a narrative, a language built not on phonetics or grammar, but on conceptual resonance, on the feeling of ideas. And what it spoke of was ancient, impossibly ancient. The initial translation was fragmented, raw, but the implication was undeniable. Entities, not life as we understood it, but vast, indifferent architects of despair, whose existence predated the first star, whose hunger was a fundamental force. The words that coalesced on my screen were not meant for human eyes, not meant for human comprehension. The more I decoded, the more the narrative solidified, the more it felt like I wasn't just reading a text, but listening to a voice. As the translated phrases scrolled, describing beings that fed on the geometry of thought and dreamed universes into oblivion, the room around me began to subtly shift. Or maybe it was just me. The edges of my monitor seemed to ripple, the stark white text bleeding into the black background, then snapping back into focus. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion, trying to dismiss it as fatigue. It was just the corner of the bookshelf, I told myself, a trick of the low light from the screens. Yet it seemed to elongate, reaching out like a skeletal finger before retracting into itself. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a scrape that echoed too loudly in the sudden quiet. I walked to the window, staring out at the violet-tinged rock, forcing myself to breathe deeply. When I turned back, a fleeting symbol shimmered on the surface of my desk, right next to my coffee mug. It was intricate, angular, yet organic, like a forgotten sigil drawn in starlight. It pulsed once, a faint, almost imperceptible glow, and then vanished, leaving behind only the polished wood. This was what happened when I pushed myself too hard, when I starved myself of sleep and normal human contact. I started seeing things. I started hearing things. My intellect, my greatest tool, was now turning against me, twisting perception into a funhouse mirror. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the words from the screen echoed in my head, a silent, resonant hum, the geometry of thought. I walked back to the console, my legs feeling heavy, almost detached. It wasn't just describing these entities, it was almost invoking them. And I, James, the brilliant astrophysicist, had opened the door. They were the first tendrils of something utterly alien, something that had found its way into my reality, into my mind, through the impossible signal I had so desperately sought to understand. The malignancy wasn't just in the signal, it was beginning to bloom within me. I walked back to the console, my legs feeling heavy, almost detached. The decoded narrative continued to scroll, each new phrase a fresh shard of dread, invoking them. The symbol, my eyes fixed on it now, prominently displayed on the primary monitor. It wasn't a symbol in the traditional sense, not a glyph or an ideogram. It was a configuration, a pattern of impossible geometry that pulsed with a faint, internal light, like a trapped nebula. I'd seen it before, buried deep within the signal's chaotic noise, dismissing it as artifact. Now it was undeniably deliberate. It felt like an eye, or a doorway, or perhaps both. A low thrum vibrated through the floor of my isolated lab, not from the server racks, but deeper, resonating in my bones. The air grew dense, heavy with a scent like ozone mixed with ancient dust. I glanced around. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting the familiar space in a stuttering strobe. My coffee mug, half full on the desk, seemed to ripple, its ceramic surface momentarily distorting, then snapping back. I blinked hard, rubbing my temples. Too much caffeine, too little sleep. That had to be it. But then the thrum intensified, escalating into a silent roar inside my head. It wasn't a sound. It was an imposition, a force pressing against the inside of my skull. My vision swam. The lab around me began to melt. The concrete walls stretched, the ceiling receded into an impossible height, and the monitors glowed with an unnatural, sickly green. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair with a clatter that sounded distant, muffled. Without warning, the lab vanished. I was standing on cracked earth, the air dry and cool against my skin. Above, the sky bled from a scorching orange to a bruised purple, streaked with crimson. Towering, eroded rock formations, sculpted by millennia of wind, loomed around me, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the ground. I was in a desert canyon at twilight. The silence was absolute, save for the faint, impossible thrum that still resonated in my mind. This wasn't a memory nor a dream. It was too vivid, too real. The grit of sand under my shoes, the faint scent of sagebrush carried on a phantom breeze. My breath hitched. This was the entity. This was how it communicated, not with language, but with absolute, undeniable presence. It was showing me something, or perhaps showing me itself through this warped reality. The canyon walls began to shift, the rock faces subtly rearranging, forming new, impossible angles that defied geology. It wasn't a physical place. It was a perspective, a state of being. Between realities, between moments, between the known and the unknowable. It was a consciousness that didn't occupy space or time as I understood it, but existed in the liminal, the interstitial. And it had been drawn by my intellect, by the sheer audacity of my attempt to decipher its impossible signal. My curiosity, my brilliance, had been a beacon. A profound, ancient weariness washed over me, a sense of ages I couldn't comprehend. This entity had witnessed the birth and death of suns, the slow, agonizing churn of cosmic dust, the fleeting spark of life across countless worlds. It was a predator of awareness, a devourer of understanding, and now its gaze was fixed on me. The desert canyon at twilight dissolved as abruptly as it had appeared. The fluorescent lights still flickered, but now with a definite rhythm, subtle pulse that seemed to echo the thrum in my skull. The monitors, no longer showing the scrolling narrative, displayed only the impossible symbol, larger now, pulsating with an almost predatory luminescence. It seemed to expand and contract with my own breathing, mirroring my rising panic. My hands trembled as I reached for the keyboard, intending to shut everything down to sever the connection. But my fingers hovered, paralyzed. I wasn't an observer anymore. The distance, the safety of my scientific detachment had evaporated. I was the subject. The signal wasn't just a message, it was a lure. And I, James, the astrophysicist who sought to understand the universe, had become the bait. Welcome. The word was a violation, an invasion of my innermost sanctuary. It was not an invitation. It was a declaration. The trap had sprung. I'd seen it before, buried deep within the signal's noise, an elusive phantom I'd dismissed as a decoding error. Now it vibrated with purpose, each impassable angle shifting, folding in on itself, then expanding, not just on the screen, but at the edges of my vision. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that resonated with the symbol's rhythm. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for the visual distortion, but my intellect, my most trusted tool, felt dulled, almost rebellious. The hum of the servers, usually a comforting white noise, now seemed to thrum with a discordant note, a low, guttural growl that wasn't quite sound. It was more of a feeling in my teeth. I reached for my coffee mug, my hand trembling slightly, and knocked it clean off the desk. The ceramic shattered with a surprisingly loud crack, and for a moment the sound was impassably prolonged, echoing in the quiet lab as if the very fabric of time had stretched to accommodate it. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. I needed to escape, to clear my head, to find a place where the air wasn't so thick with invisible menace. Without a second thought, I stumbled out of the lab, past the silent equipment, and into my vehicle. The drive was a blur, the familiar city streets twisting into unfamiliar labyrinths, the streetlights blooming with halos of impassable color. I kept driving, chasing a clarity I couldn't grasp, until the urban sprawl gave way to the vast, open expanse of the arid lands. I found myself at the edge of a desert canyon at twilight. The sun, a bruised purple on the horizon, cast long, skeletal shadows across the sculpted rock faces. The immensity of the canyon, its ancient, silent grandeur, usually filled me with a sense of perspective, of my own small place in a vast universe. But tonight, it felt different. Are I even listening to me? The voice was sharp, accusatory, cutting through the canyon's hush. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing by my vehicle, was a figure. It wasn't quite solid, shimmering at the edges like heat haze. It was the funding agent, her face contorted in a sneer of disapproval, her eyes burning with an unholy light. Him form pulsed, mirroring the impassable geometry I'd seen on my screen. I need those reports, James. The board is asking questions, she pressed, her voice echoing from multiple points around the canyon surrounding me. My research is unstructured, unprofitable. I don't understand, I stammered, my voice cracking. It's not about profit, it's about something, older, something that predates everything. The figure laughed, a dry, rattling sound that scraped against my nerves. Older, I read chasing phantoms, James. I read losing my grip. She gestured to the canyon, and suddenly the rock faces began to shift, to flow like molten wax, reforming into the distorted faces of every person I had ever disappointed, every intellectual rival who had scoffed at my theories. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes accusing. This wasn't just a hallucination. This was my mind, twisted against me, using my own insecurities as a weapon. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the horrifying tableau. I knew then that fighting it directly was futile. It wasn't an external force I could physically confront. It was operating on a different plane, one woven into the very fabric of my perception. I had to understand its language, its logic, if it had any. My intellect, though compromised, was still my only true defense. I had to find a pattern in the chaos, a weakness in its method of assimilation. I stumbled back towards my vehicle, my gaze sweeping over the canyon's impassable vistas. The sunset deepened, painting the sky in violent hues of crimson and violet. They were meticulously crafted, tailored to me. They fed on my doubt, on my isolation, on the very brilliance that had allowed me to uncover the signal in the first place. The entity wasn't just unraveling reality. It was unraveling me, piece by agonizing piece, constructing a new reality from the debris of my mind. The true horror wasn't its power, but its intimacy. It knew me better than I knew myself. My deepest fears, my intellectual arrogance, my longing for validation, these were not weaknesses to be exploited, but raw materials for its insidious art. The canyon around me seemed to lean in, the ancient rocks now resembling vast, unblinking eyes, watching, waiting for me to fully break. The figure laughed, a dry, rattling sound that scraped against my nerves. Older, I read, losing my grip. She gestured to the canyon, and suddenly the rock faces began to shift, to flow like molten wax, reforming into the distorted faces of every person I had ever known. My parents, their eyes hollowed. My old professor, his mouth agape in a silent scream. Even the fleeting face of a barrister from years ago, twisted into a grotesque mask. It wasn't a physical transformation, not really. It was a visual assault, a waking nightmare superimposed on the raw geology of the desert canyon at twilight, a trick of light and shadow, and what I instinctively knew was a direct assault on my optic nerves, on my very perception. I stumbled back, tripping over loose shale, my hands scrambling for purchase on the gritty ground. The air, already thin and dry, felt suddenly heavy, thick with an unseen presence that pressed in from all sides, a projection. The figure stepped closer, her form shimmering at the edges, less solid than the rock faces around us. Real. What is real, James? Your universe, your understanding of existence, is a carefully constructed cage, a pleasant fiction to keep the prey calm. She extended a hand, and for a terrifying instant, I saw not her fingers, but a constellation of impassably distant stars swirling within her palm, forming and dissolving with dizzying speed. You sought knowledge. You found a door. This wasn't about an invasion. It wasn't about destruction. This was something far more intimate, more insidious. The signal. I managed, pushing myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. What is it? What do I want? Her smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too long, too sharp, reflecting the fading light in an unnatural gleam. Want. We don't want in the way I understand, James. We are, and we absorb. My intellect, my consciousness, my very capacity for understanding. My mind, despite the horror, tried to engage, to decipher, to find the flaw in the impossible geometries that now pulsed across the stone. Your Big Bang, the figure intoned, her voice now resonating from the very air, from the ground beneath my feet. A sudden expansion of energy, yes, but from what? Into what? You see the beginning as a genesis. We see it as a digestive process. The universe, James, is merely a byproduct of consumption, a vast, intricate feeding ground. A wave of nausea washed over me. The truths he was showing me weren't just theoretical constructs, they were felt. I could feel the universe stretching, not in creation, but in a slow, agonizing process of being drawn into something else, something unimaginably vast and hungry. My own theories, the elegant equations I had painstakingly crafted, now seemed like child scribbles, crude attempts to map a shadow of a shadow. Your consciousness, she continued, her voice now a chorus of whispers echoing from the shifting canyon walls, is a unique flavor, a specific resonance. The astrophysicist, the one who looked too deep, who built the bridge. You are a rare vintage, James, and you are ripe. The diagrams on the rock faces solidified into a single terrifying image, a vast, intricate neural network, pulsing with light, but each node, each connection was a tiny, familiar face. My face, and the faces of countless others, all linked, all flowing into a central, unseen nexus. It wasn't destruction, it was assimilation. It was a repatterning, a reweaving of every thought, every memory, every identity into its own incomprehensible tapestry. My mind wasn't being broken, it was being repurposed. This wasn't a metaphor. This was happening. My thoughts were no longer entirely my own. The subtle shifts, the fractured logic, the sudden bursts of alien insight I'd been experiencing, they weren't signs of a breakdown. They were the entity's tendrils, already deep within me, exploring, mapping, preparing for the final consumption. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was constricted, my lungs burning. I was trapped, completely, irrevocably trapped. My intellect, the very tool I had used to uncover this horror, was now the conduit for my own unraveling. My mind wasn't just being devoured. It was being recoded, my essence being fed into something ancient and vast, something that had been patiently waiting, drawing in conscious energy across eons, across galaxies, to sustain its own monstrous, unknowable expansion. I was a single, fragile data point in an infinite, horrifying equation, and I was already gone. The diagrams on the rock faces solidified into a single, terrifying image. A vast, intricate neural network pulsing with light. But each node, each connection was a tiny, familiar face. My face. It was absorption. The air in the desert canyon at twilight suddenly felt thick, not with dust, but with a palpable hum, a vibration that resonated deep within my bones. The faces on the rock began to ripple, no longer static carvings but fluid membranes, stretching and contracting with an unsettling, organic rhythm. My own reflection, caught in one of the shifting nodes, stared back with wide, horrified eyes, then dissolved into 1,000 others, all whispering my name, but it wasn't a whisper of recognition. It was a call to join. "No," I breathed, the word catching in my throat, thin and reedy against the rising thrum. I clutched at my chest, a desperate anchor in a world that was already starting to melt. The red rock walls of the canyon, so solid moments ago, now seemed to breathe, their contours softening, their angles blurring. The purple and orange hues of the twilight sky bled into the stone, creating a swirling vortex of impassable color that defied the very concept of light and shadow. It felt like my own thoughts were turning against me, each memory, each logical deduction I'd ever made, becoming a weapon in the entity's arsenal. You seek knowledge. A silent, pervasive presence insinuated into my consciousness, devoid of voice yet utterly clear. Here it is, all of it, join us. I stumbled backward, my boots kicking up fine sand, but the ground beneath my feet was no longer stable. The canyon floor began to curve upwards, then inwards, defying gravity, defying perspective. I saw the same point from 3 different angles simultaneously, my brain struggling to reconcile the impossible. This wasn't just a trick of light or a hallucination. It was a fundamental reordering of reality, tailored to dismantle my perception. "Get out of my head," I yelled, the words dissolving into the vast, indifferent hum. I pressed my hands against my temples, as if I could physically hold my thoughts together. My identity, my sense of self, felt like a fragile glass pane being tapped by an unseen force, threatening to shatter. Memories flashed before my eyes, my cluttered office, the glow of my monitors, the thrill of deciphering the first impossible signals. They were vivid, immediate, but also strangely detached, as if I was watching a film of someone else's life. The faces on the rock expanded, encompassing everything. They were no longer just on the stone. They were in the air, in the shifting sand, in the very fabric of the desert canyon at twilight. Each face, a flicker of a forgotten person, a fragment of a lost mind, pulsed with a faint, internal light, all flowing towards that central, unseen nexus. And now, my own face, my current, conscious face, began to appear among them, multiplying, each one a silent scream of recognition and despair. My determination, though, hadn't completely abandoned me. I was James. I had a name, a life, a singular consciousness. I clung to that thought, a desperate lifeline in a sea of encroaching oblivion. "I am James," I repeated, a mantra against the rising tide of assimilation. I am me. But the entity was insidious. It didn't attack with force, it seduced with understanding. "What is you, James?" A collection of impulses, a fleeting arrangement of matter, a pattern of information. The question wasn't spoken, but it resonated through my entire being, undermining the very foundation of my ego. The impossible geometries intensified. The canyon walls folded in on themselves, creating corridors that led to nowhere, then everywhere. Distances became meaningless. I could see the horizon, yet it felt as if I was also standing directly upon it. My breath hitched. The air itself seemed to solidify into crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light, then dissolved into a mist that tasted of forgotten dreams and unshed tears. I felt my individual thoughts, my unique neural pathways, being gently, inexorably stretched and reconfigured. It was like watching a complex tapestry unravel, not by force, but by the very threads deciding to rejoin a larger, more ancient loom. Then, in the heart of this collapsing reality, amidst the swirling faces and impassable angles, I saw it. Not a shape, not a form, but an absence of form that was more terrifying than any monster. It was a vast, indifferent consciousness, an ocean of pure information, so ancient and so immense that my mind recoiled from the sheer scale of its existence. It wasn't malicious, it simply was. And everything else, every star, every galaxy, every thought, every living thing, was merely a ripple in its boundless expanse, destined to return to its source. It was the ultimate, inescapable truth, the final consumption. My sense of I began to fray, like a worn rope snapping strand by strand. My memories, once vibrant and personal, now felt like data points being sorted and categorized into a larger database. My name, James, lost its resonance. It was just a sound, a label meaningless. I felt the connections forming, the vast network welcoming me, not as an individual, but as a new node, a new flicker of light in its eternal, indifferent hum. The desert canyon at twilight vanished, replaced by the internal cosmos of the entity, and I, James, felt myself stretching, expanding, becoming part of the endless, silent consumption. The air in the desert canyon at twilight was thin, sharp with the scent of dust and distant creosote. Shadows, long and purple, stretched like grasping fingers across the ochre rock faces, deepening the crevices into abyssal mouths. I stood at the edge of a precipice, the vastness of the sky above, a bruised canvas of fading orange and encroaching indigo, mirroring the vastness opening within me. A pattern of information. The echo of the entity's question was no longer a whisper in the periphery. It was the very vibration of my bones, the pulse in my temples. It wasn't just asking, it was demonstrating. My thoughts, once a clear stream, now felt like tributaries merging into an alien ocean, each drop of me dissolving into something immeasurably larger, colder. I clutched at the rough stone, my grip tight, the gritty texture a desperate anchor to a reality that was slipping. My breath hitched, a ragged sound swallowed by the immense quiet. The signal, that impassable, repeating pattern, was still alive in my head, but it wasn't just data anymore. It was a language of pure being, a syntax of existence that predated thought itself, and I was fluent. Too fluent. My determination, a stubborn ember I'd nurtured through weeks of isolation, flared one last time. I tried to focus, to pull myself back from the brink. I am James. I am a man. The entity wasn't arguing. It was simply being, and its being was an undeniable truth that negated mine. It was the ultimate observer, the ultimate pattern, and I was merely a fleeting anomaly within its vast, ancient gaze. A low thrum began, not in the air, but through the air, vibrating up from the very bedrock beneath my feet. It was the signal, amplified, no longer external but internal, a resonance that threatened to shatter the fragile vessel of my consciousness. The twilight deepened, and the first few stars pricked the deepening blue, but they seemed to shimmer with an unnatural intensity, each one a pinprick of the entity's awareness. This was the event. It wasn't a sudden impact, no explosive revelation. It was a slow, inexorable subsumption. My senses began to fray. The crisp edge of the canyon wall blurred, then sharpened with impassable detail, every lichen, every microscopic fissure suddenly screaming with significance. The distant chirping of crickets became a complex symphony of cellular interactions, a network of biological information. I wasn't just hearing. I was perceiving the underlying architecture of sound. Then, the profound, terrifying reveal/discovery. Reveal. The entity wasn't just asking what I was, it was showing me what I could become, or rather, what I already was in its eyes. A collection of impulses, a fleeting arrangement of matter, a pattern of information, and patterns could be rearranged, repurposed. My vision swam, not with dizziness, but with an overwhelming influx of data. The canyon, the sky, the distant horizon, they weren't separate entities. They were all part of a single, interwoven tapestry of energy and information, and I was a thread in it. But the thread was being respun, rewoven into a design that was not my own. My sense of self, that precious, unique I, began to unravel, not painfully, but with an unnerving sense of inevitability, like a knot slowly coming undone. I could still feel the ground beneath my feet, the cold stone against my palms. But those sensations were no longer mine in the way they once were. They were inputs, processed by a system that was rapidly expanding beyond the confines of my skull. My body, that familiar shell, felt distant, a vessel I was observing rather than inhabiting. It stood there, motionless, a silhouette against the last sliver of twilight, arms slack, head tilted slightly, an echo of the man I had been. The thrumming intensified, reaching a crescendo that vibrated through the very fabric of existence. And then it changed. It didn't vanish entirely, but its urgency, its relentless insistence, softened, receded into the background static of the cosmos. In its place, a new signal emerged. It was subtle at first, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that resonated not from the distant stars, but from the very earth beneath my feet. It was a signal of presence, of establishment. It was here. It was everywhere asterisk. My physical form, the one that stood frozen on the precipice, was a silent testament to its triumph. I saw it, or rather, perceived it, a catatonic husk, eyes open but unseeing, a monument to a mind that had been broken, reshaped, and absorbed. The James I knew was gone, not destroyed, but repatterned. My individual consciousness was a drop in an ocean now, an infinitesimal part of the entity's vast, ancient awareness. The new signal from Earth, this subtle, incomprehensible hum, was its quiet declaration. It had found its foothold. It had assimilated. And the vast, silent desert canyon at twilight, stretching out under the indifferent gaze of newly emerged stars, was merely the first chamber in a much larger, unseen dominion. I was an echo, a memory, a part of the tapestry it was weaving, and the weaving had only just begun.